The nanny's voice was like angels singing, and children would calm instantly upon hearing her lullabies. Families were grateful for this miracle, until they discovered where their children really were. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's begin our journey together tonight. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Ravenshollow Manor as Lord Henry Ashford paced the length of his study, his boots echoing on polished oak floors that had witnessed 3 generations of family crises. His wife, Lady Catherine, sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had grown damp from hours of tears. Between them lay the source of their current desperation, a letter of resignation from their 6th nanny in as many months. 7-year-old Lady Emily Ashford had proven to be what polite society terms spirited, though her previous caretakers had used considerably less charitable descriptions. The child possessed an intellect that far exceeded her years, combined with a willful independence that made her virtually impossible to manage through conventional means. She had reduced grown women to tears, driven experienced governesses to nervous breakdowns, and created household chaos that threatened to destroy the family's carefully maintained social reputation. The advertisement that Lord Ashford had placed in the London Times had been deliberately understated, describing the position as challenging but rewarding work in a distinguished household. He had learned from bitter experience that honest descriptions of Emily's behavior would attract only the most desperate candidates, women whose circumstances made them unsuitable for caring for a child of Emily's elevated social position. Madam Cordelia Blackthorn arrived at Ravenshollow Manor on a fog-shrouded November morning, her carriage emerging from the mist like something from a fairy tale. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair arranged in an elegant chignon and eyes the color of deep amber that seemed to hold mysterious depths. Her dress was fashionable but understated, suggesting refined taste without ostentation, while her bearing projected the confidence of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. The interview took place in the morning room, where Lady Catherine had arranged an informal tea service that would allow her to observe how the candidate handled herself in a social setting. Madam Cordelia's manners were flawless, her conversation intelligent without being forward, and her references from previous positions were impressive without being so glowing as to seem fabricated. She spoke of children with genuine warmth, while demonstrating practical understanding of the challenges involved in managing young minds that developed faster than their emotional maturity. When asked about her methods for handling difficult children, Madam Cordelia had smiled with mysterious confidence. "Music," she had said simply. "I find that the right melody can soothe even the most troubled spirit. Children respond to songs in ways that mere words cannot achieve, and I have been blessed with a voice that seems to calm the most restless souls." The demonstration of her abilities came when Lady Emily burst into the morning room with her characteristic dramatic flair, determined to assert her dominance over yet another potential caretaker. The child was prepared for battle, her dark eyes flashing with the intelligence and determination that had defeated so many previous opponents. She opened her mouth to deliver what was undoubtedly a carefully prepared speech designed to drive away this latest threat to her independence. But Madam Cordelia had begun to sing before Emily could speak, her voice filling the room with a melody that seemed to come from some realm beyond ordinary human experience. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, neither recognizable as a traditional lullaby nor entirely foreign, creating harmonies that resonated in ways that conventional music could never achieve. The effect on Emily was immediate and dramatic. Her rebellious expression softened into wonder, her rigid posture relaxed, and her eyes took on a dreamy quality that suggested complete absorption in the musical experience. Lord and Lady Ashford watched in amazement as their impossible daughter transformed before their eyes. The child who had terrorized a succession of caretakers stood motionless, swaying gently to Madam Cordelia's ethereal melody, her face displaying the peaceful contentment that her parents had not seen since her earliest infancy. When the song concluded, Emily moved to Madam Cordelia's side with the trusting affection of a lamb approaching its shepherd. The hiring was immediate and unanimous. Madam Cordelia was installed in the nursery wing of Ravenshollow Manor with a salary that reflected both the family's desperation and their gratitude for finding someone who could manage their challenging daughter. The transformation in Emily's behavior was so dramatic that within days, guests were commenting on the child's remarkable improvement and praising Lord and Lady Ashford for their wisdom in securing such an exceptional caretaker. Emily's days under Madam Cordelia's care followed patterns that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. The child would wake each morning refreshed and compliant, spending her lessons in rapt attention while displaying none of the defiance that had characterized her previous educational experiences. Mealtimes became peaceful affairs where Emily ate whatever was placed before her without complaint, while evenings concluded with Madam Cordelia's lullabies that seemed to transport the child into realms of perfect tranquility. The nanny's repertoire of songs appeared limitless, with different melodies for different moods and circumstances. She possessed lullabies that could calm tantrums, melodies that encouraged cooperation, and harmonies that seemed to make Emily eager to please in ways that her parents had never believed possible. The child's former willfulness had been replaced by a dreamy compliance that made her the perfect model of aristocratic childhood. But the perfection of Emily's transformation began to concern Lady Catherine as the weeks passed. While she was grateful for the peace that Madam Cordelia had brought to their household, there was something unsettling about the completeness of the change in her daughter's personality. Emily had lost not only her defiance but also the spark of independent thinking that had made her such a memorable child. She moved through her days with the mechanical obedience of a wind-up toy, responding to instructions without question while displaying little of her former curiosity or creative thinking. When Lady Catherine raised these concerns with Madam Cordelia, the nanny had responded with reassuring explanations about the natural development of children who finally received proper guidance and structure. Emily was simply learning appropriate behavior, she explained, while the calming influence of music was helping her develop emotional regulation that would serve her well throughout her life. The changes might seem dramatic, but they represented healthy growth rather than cause for concern. The crisis came on a December morning, when Lady Catherine went to the nursery to check on Emily before breakfast, only to find the room empty. Madam Cordelia was nowhere to be found, and Emily's bed appeared not to have been slept in. A thorough search of the manor revealed no trace of either the child or her caretaker, though the servants reported hearing Madam Cordelia's lullabies throughout the previous evening as usual. Lord Ashford's immediate assumption was that Emily had somehow convinced her nanny to take her on an unauthorized excursion, perhaps to visit the village or explore the estate's grounds. But as hours passed without any sign of their return, concern grew into alarm, and alarm escalated into panic. The local constabulary was summoned, search parties were organized, and inquiries were made at every inn and coaching station within a day's travel of Ravenshollow Manor. The investigation revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Madam Cordelia's background that should have been apparent during the hiring process. The references she had provided led to addresses that did not exist, former employers who had never heard of her, and recommendations that appeared to have been forged with impressive skill. The woman who had seemed like a miracle worker sent by Providence had vanished as mysteriously as she had arrived, taking with her the child who had trusted her completely. Days stretched into weeks without any trace of Emily or her kidnapper. The searches expanded across counties, rewards were posted throughout the kingdom, and appeals were made to anyone who might have encountered a woman traveling with a young girl matching Emily's description. But Madam Cordelia seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of her beautiful voice and the devastating absence of the child she had stolen. The true horror of the situation became apparent when Lord Ashford received a letter bearing no return address or identifying marks. The message was brief and written in an elegant feminine hand that demanded a ransom of £10,000 in exchange for Emily's safe return. The payment was to be made through an elaborate system of intermediaries that would ensure the kidnapper's anonymity while providing proof that Emily remained alive and unharmed. But the most chilling aspect of the ransom demand was its casual tone, suggesting that Emily's abduction had been planned with meticulous care rather than resulting from any spontaneous opportunity. Madam Cordelia had entered their household not as a desperate woman seeking employment, but as a predator who had identified their family as suitable prey for an elaborate criminal enterprise. The lullabies that had seemed so miraculous were revealed to be tools of manipulation that had prepared Emily for her eventual disappearance. The Ashford family faced an impossible choice between paying an enormous sum to criminals whose trustworthiness could not be verified and accepting the possibility that they might never see their daughter again. The decision was complicated by their awareness that meeting the ransom demands would encourage further kidnappings, while refusing might cost Emily her life. Either choice carried consequences that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. As winter deepened around Ravenshollow Manor, the empty nursery served as a constant reminder of how completely they had been deceived by a woman whose beautiful voice had masked intentions that were anything but angelic. The perfect nanny had proven to be the perfect predator, using abilities that seemed almost supernatural to achieve criminal objectives that conventional methods could never have accomplished. Lord and Lady Ashford were left to contemplate the bitter irony that their daughter's greatest strength, her intelligence and independence, had ultimately made her vulnerable to someone who understood exactly how to exploit the very qualities that made her special. Madam Cordelia had not broken Emily's spirit through force or cruelty, but had instead redirected it through methods that appeared to be acts of kindness and care. The search for Emily would continue, but her parents were beginning to understand that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprise. Madam Cordelia possessed talents that conventional law enforcement was ill-equipped to address, while her understanding of human psychology made her virtually impossible to anticipate or capture through normal investigative methods. The origins of Madam Cordelia Blackthorn's extraordinary abilities could be traced to her childhood in the traveling theater company that had crossed Europe in the early decades of the century, when entertainment and education blended with practices that more conventional societies would have found disturbing. Born Cordelia Marsh to performers whose specialty involved psychological entertainment that bordered on mesmerism, she had grown up understanding that the human mind could be influenced through techniques that appeared to be simple artistic performance. Her mother, Madame Evangeline Marsh, had been celebrated throughout the continent for her ability to entrance audiences through singing that seemed to transport listeners into altered states of consciousness. The family's performances were marketed as musical entertainment, but informed observers recognized elements of hypnotic induction that had been developed through careful study of mesmerist techniques and ancient practices that predated scientific understanding of consciousness manipulation. Young Cordelia had demonstrated natural aptitude for these family arts from an early age, possessing a voice that could produce harmonies and overtones that affected listeners in ways that conventional singing could never achieve. Her musical education had included not only traditional vocal training, but also instruction in the psychological principles that governed how sound could influence human behavior, attention, and memory formation. The theater company's repertoire had included performances that demonstrated the power of music to alter consciousness for audiences who believed they were witnessing mere entertainment. Volunteers from the audience would be invited to participate in musical experiences that left them with no memory of what had transpired, while retaining powerful compulsions to behave in ways that served the performers' purposes. These demonstrations were presented as amusing diversions, but they represented sophisticated applications of psychological manipulation that few observers understood. Cordelia's formal education in these techniques had been supplemented by study of ancient texts that described the use of specific musical patterns for purposes that conventional society would have condemned. The family's library contained manuscripts that discussed the application of sound frequencies for inducing trance states, controlling behavior, and implanting suggestions that would influence subjects long after the initial musical experience had concluded. The transformation from artistic curiosity to criminal application had begun when the theater company encountered financial difficulties that threatened their continued operations. Traditional entertainment was facing competition from newer forms of spectacle, while growing skepticism about mesmerist practices had made their audiences more critical and less willing to pay premium prices for experiences that they increasingly viewed as fraudulent. Cordelia's solution had involved adapting her musical abilities for purposes that would generate substantial income while avoiding the scrutiny that public performances attracted. Rather than entertaining audiences, she would use her voice to influence individuals whose wealth made them attractive targets for systematic exploitation. The techniques that had been developed for stage entertainment could be modified for private applications that would serve criminal rather than artistic objectives. Her first systematic experiment had involved securing employment as a music teacher for the children of wealthy merchants in London, a position that provided access to households while establishing her reputation as someone dedicated to nurturing young minds through artistic education. The families who hired her were seeking cultural refinement for their children, never suspecting that their music teacher possessed abilities that transcended conventional vocal instruction. The children under Cordelia's tutelage had shown remarkable improvement in both musical ability and general behavior, transformations that their parents attributed to her exceptional teaching methods and natural affinity for working with young minds. What these families did not understand was that Cordelia's lessons included hypnotic elements that made children increasingly compliant while creating powerful psychological bonds that could be exploited for purposes beyond musical education. The development of her signature lullabies had required extensive experimentation with different musical patterns, frequencies, and lyrical content that would produce optimal effects on young minds. Children's consciousness was more malleable than adult awareness, making them ideal subjects for techniques that might prove less effective on fully developed personalities. Cordelia discovered that carefully constructed melodies could induce states that were deeper and more lasting than anything achievable through conventional hypnosis. Her breakthrough had come with the creation of what she privately termed progressive induction sequences. Lullabies that began with apparently innocent melodies but gradually incorporated elements that deepened the listener's trance state while implanting suggestions that would influence behavior long after the music had ended. Children who heard these songs would become increasingly responsive to Cordelia's voice while losing awareness of their previous independence and critical thinking abilities. The psychological mechanisms underlying her techniques drew upon research that was beginning to emerge about the relationship between consciousness, memory, and behavioral modification. Cordelia understood that children's minds were particularly susceptible to musical influence during the transitional periods between waking and sleeping consciousness, when normal mental defenses were reduced and new patterns could be established with minimal resistance. The customization of her lullabies for specific children required careful observation of individual psychological profiles, family dynamics, and environmental factors that would influence the effectiveness of different approaches. Some children responded best to melodies that emphasized emotional comfort, while others were more susceptible to songs that encouraged compliance through rhythm and repetition. Cordelia developed an extensive repertoire that could be adapted to virtually any young personality. The implementation of her kidnapping scheme had required establishing networks of contacts who could assist with the practical aspects of child disappearance and ransom collection, while remaining ignorant of the methods she used to ensure her victims' cooperation. These associates believed they were working with someone who possessed unusual influence over children, never suspecting that her control was based on psychological techniques that bordered on supernatural in their effectiveness. The children who fell under Cordelia's influence experienced changes that appeared gradual and natural to outside observers, but which actually represented systematic modification of their consciousness and will. Her lullabies created states of dependency that made resistance psychologically impossible while establishing behavioral patterns that ensured compliance with whatever instructions she chose to provide. The most sophisticated aspect of Cordelia's system was its integration of psychological manipulation with genuine care and affection that made her victims genuinely grateful for her attention. Children under her influence did not feel coerced or frightened, but rather experienced a sense of security and belonging that made them eager to please their beloved caretaker. This emotional component made detection virtually impossible while ensuring that her victims would cooperate enthusiastically with whatever plans she had for their futures. The ransom demands that followed each kidnapping were carefully structured to maximize profit while minimizing risk of discovery or pursuit. Cordelia had studied the psychology of wealthy families facing crisis, understanding that parents would pay virtually any price for their children's return, while being reluctant to involve authorities whose intervention might endanger the victim's safety. The children themselves became willing participants in maintaining their captivity, genuinely believing that they were safer and happier with Cordelia than they had been in their original homes. Her lullabies had created psychological bonds that transcended normal family relationships, making the children feel that leaving her care would represent abandonment rather than rescue. As her operations expanded, Cordelia refined her techniques to address increasingly complex scenarios involving children from different social backgrounds and family circumstances. Each case provided opportunities to test new approaches while building a criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits with minimal risk of detection or punishment. The perfect crime, Cordelia had discovered, was one where the victims cooperated enthusiastically while their families paid enormous sums for the privilege of being robbed. Her lullabies had created a form of psychological alchemy that transformed children into willing accomplices while converting parental love into renewable sources of income. The techniques she had perfected represented more than criminal innovation. They demonstrated that conventional understanding of childhood psychology and family relationships was inadequate to address threats that combined genuine artistic ability with systematic exploitation of human emotional vulnerabilities. Cordelia had become something unique in criminal history, a predator whose victims loved her for the very actions that destroyed their lives. The spring of 1851 marked the expansion of Cordelia's operations beyond isolated incidents into a systematic enterprise that would target the wealthiest families throughout England with the precision of a military campaign. Her success with the Ashford family had provided both the financial resources and the psychological insights necessary to scale her methods into an operation that would reshape her from opportunistic criminal into the architect of an unprecedented form of organized crime. Lord William Pemberton received his introduction to Cordelia's services through carefully orchestrated social connections that made her recruitment appear to be the fortunate result of mutual acquaintances rather than deliberate targeting. His twin daughters, Isabella and Victoria, aged 8 and 9 respectively, had gained reputations as the most challenging children in their county, their combined energy and intelligence creating household chaos that had driven away a succession of governesses and tutors. Cordelia's arrival at Pemberton Hall was accompanied by references that painted her as a specialist in managing difficult children, though the specific nature of her methods remained diplomatically vague. Lord Pemberton's desperation for solutions to his domestic crisis had made him less thorough in his investigations than prudence would normally have dictated, while Lady Pemberton's exhaustion from dealing with their daughter's behavior had made her grateful for any prospect of relief. The transformation of Isabella and Victoria under Cordelia's care had been even more dramatic than what the Ashford family had experienced. The twins' synchronized rebellion against authority had been replaced by harmonious cooperation that seemed almost supernatural in its completeness. Their former tendency to create elaborate schemes for avoiding lessons and responsibilities had evolved into eager participation in whatever activities Cordelia suggested, while their legendary ability to manipulate adults through coordinated efforts had been redirected towards serving their beloved caretaker's interests. The Pemberton twins' disappearance had been orchestrated with theatrical precision that demonstrated Cordelia's growing confidence in her abilities. Rather than simply vanishing during the night, the children had left behind a carefully staged scene that suggested they had departed voluntarily to embark on some adventure that their imagination had made irresistible. Their beds had been slept in, their clothes selected with obvious care, and their favorite toys arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate preparation rather than hasty flight. The ransom demand that followed had been more sophisticated than what the Ashford family had received, incorporating psychological elements that increased pressure while making compliance seem like the only rational response to their crisis. The letter had included details about the twins' daily activities and preferences that could only have been known to someone with intimate access to their lives, proving that the kidnapper possessed ongoing contact with the children while demonstrating her ability to monitor their well-being. Duke Wellington's family had represented Cordelia's most ambitious target yet, their vast wealth and political influence making them both attractive prospects and dangerous adversaries. The Duke's son, Lord Edward Wellington, aged 10, had been identified as particularly suitable for Cordelia's methods due to his sensitive temperament and his family's tendency to seek unconventional solutions for managing his delicate constitution. The recruitment process for the Wellington position had required months of careful preparation, with Cordelia establishing credentials that would withstand the thorough investigation that such an important family would naturally conduct. Her references had been backed by actual former employers who had been carefully selected and prepared to provide authentic testimony about her capabilities, though none of them understood the true nature of her influence over children or the ultimate objectives of her employment. Lord Edward's captivity had been managed with particular sophistication, as his family's resources and connections made prolonged deception more challenging than what Cordelia had previously attempted. The boy had been gradually prepared for his eventual departure through lullabies that created powerful compulsions to seek adventure beyond his family's estate, making his disappearance appear to be the result of natural childhood wanderlust rather than adult manipulation. The ransom negotiations for Lord Edward had revealed the full extent of Cordelia's criminal organization, involving intermediaries who operated across multiple countries while maintaining complete ignorance about each other's roles or identities. The payment system had been designed to ensure that even if one component was discovered and investigated, the overall network would remain intact while protecting Cordelia's anonymity and freedom of movement. The psychological profiles that Cordelia developed for each target family had enabled her to customize her approach for maximum effectiveness while minimizing the risk of unexpected complications. She had learned to identify the specific vulnerabilities that would make parents most susceptible to her demands, whether through exploitation of guilt, fear, or their children's safety, or the social pressures that accompanied public knowledge of family crises. The children who had been successfully captured through Cordelia's methods had been integrated into what she privately termed her invisible orphanage, a network of safe houses and caretaker facilities that provided comfortable living conditions while ensuring that escape or rescue remained impossible. The victims genuinely believed that they were living in superior circumstances compared to their original homes, making them willing participants in maintaining their own captivity. The operational security that protected Cordelia's enterprise had been designed with paranoid attention to compartmentalization and redundancy. No individual involved in the organization possessed enough information to compromise more than a small portion of the overall operation, while multiple backup systems ensured that the loss of any component would not significantly disrupt continued activity. The financial success of the ransom network had exceeded even Cordelia's ambitious projections, generating wealth that enabled continued expansion while providing resources for increasingly sophisticated operations. Each successful kidnapping enhanced her reputation among criminal associates, while providing capital for recruiting additional personnel and establishing new operational bases. The integration of her hypnotic abilities with conventional criminal techniques had created synergies that made her organization virtually undetectable through normal law enforcement methods. Children who might have provided crucial evidence about their captivity were psychologically incapable of betraying their beloved caretaker, while parents who paid ransoms were reluctant to pursue investigations that might endanger future communications with their children's kidnappers. The geographic distribution of Cordelia's operations had been carefully planned to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention from authorities who specialized in tracking criminal organizations. Her targets were selected from different regions and social circles, while the timing of kidnappings was varied to prevent the emergence of obvious connections that might suggest coordinated activities. The most innovative aspect of Cordelia's enterprise was its sustainability, as the psychological bonds she created with her victims ensured that they would remain loyal and cooperative indefinitely. Unlike conventional kidnapping operations that faced increasing risk as time passed, Cordelia's methods created self-maintaining systems that actually became more secure as her influence over the children deepened. The correspondence between kidnapped children and their families had become a crucial component of the ongoing operations, providing emotional reassurance that maintained parental cooperation while generating additional income through supplemental demands for special privileges or improved conditions. These letters were written by children who genuinely believed they were helping their beloved caretaker while maintaining connections with families they still loved, but no longer felt compelled to return to. The expansion of Cordelia's network into international markets had required establishing relationships with criminal organizations that operated across national boundaries, though these associates remained ignorant of the specific methods she used to maintain control over her victims. Her reputation within these circles was based on her remarkable success rate and the complete absence of rescued victims who might provide evidence about her operations. As the network grew in scope and sophistication, Cordelia had begun to understand that she had created something unprecedented in criminal history, a form of organized crime that converted human emotional bonds into renewable sources of income while maintaining the complete loyalty of its victims. The children she had captured genuinely loved their captor, while their families continued paying for the privilege of knowing their children were safe and happy. The ransom network had evolved beyond mere criminal enterprise into a form of alternative family structure that served Cordelia's interests, while providing genuine benefits to children who had been removed from conventional family situations. Her victims experienced improvements in education, cultural enrichment, and emotional security that made their captivity appear beneficial rather than harmful to outside observers who understood only part of the overall situation. The success of her operations had proven that conventional understanding of childhood psychology and family relationships was inadequate to address threats that combined genuine care with systematic exploitation. Cordelia had discovered that the most effective forms of control were those that appeared to serve the victim's interests while advancing objectives that they would never consciously choose to support. The first person to recognize the true nature of Cordelia's operations was Thomas Hartwell, a young musician whose exceptional hearing and deep understanding of musical psychology had prepared him to detect patterns that escaped ordinary observation. At 24, Thomas possessed both the technical knowledge of sound theory and the investigative instincts necessary to unravel mysteries that conventional authorities had proven incapable of solving. Thomas's involvement in the case had begun when his own sister, Margaret, had been hired as a music teacher by a family whose previous instructor had departed under mysterious circumstances. Margaret had reported strange occurrences during her lessons, children who seemed unusually compliant, parents who spoke of their previous teacher's miraculous abilities, and household atmospheres that suggested recent trauma or upheaval that no one was willing to discuss directly. The pattern of missing children had initially appeared to be coincidental to Thomas, representing the kind of tragic but unrelated incidents that occasionally affected wealthy families throughout the kingdom. However, his sister's observations about the musical elements that connected several of these cases had suggested possibilities that conventional investigation had overlooked. The families affected had all recently employed female music teachers or nannies who were noted for their exceptional singing abilities. Thomas's musical education had included study of historical techniques for using sound to influence human consciousness, knowledge that most contemporary musicians considered academic curiosity rather than practical application. His understanding of harmonic relationships, frequency manipulation, and rhythmic patterns that could affect brainwave activity had prepared him to recognize that music could be employed for purposes far beyond entertainment or education. The investigation that Thomas undertook required gaining access to families who had been affected by the disappearances while avoiding the attention of anyone who might be monitoring such inquiries. His credentials as a professional musician provided legitimate reasons for studying the musical education that wealthy families provided for their children, while his apparent academic interest in teaching methods deflected suspicion from his true investigative purposes. The breakthrough in Thomas's research had come through analysis of musical fragments that he collected from various sources, sheet music left behind by departed teachers, melodies that children hummed unconsciously, and songs that servants reported hearing during the evening hours when lessons were conducted. His detailed study of these musical elements had revealed patterns that suggested systematic application of hypnotic induction techniques disguised as innocent lullabies and educational songs. The technical analysis that Thomas conducted had utilized equipment that he had developed for studying the relationship between musical frequency and psychological response, research that had originally been intended for improving concert hall acoustics, but proved applicable to more sinister purposes. His measurements had revealed that the songs associated with missing children contained specific combinations of frequencies and rhythmic patterns that were known to affect consciousness in ways that made subjects more susceptible to suggestion and behavioral modification. The most disturbing discovery in Thomas's investigation had been the sophistication of the psychological manipulation that was embedded within apparently innocent musical instruction. The songs that had been taught to victims contained multiple layers of meaning and influence, with surface melodies that seemed appropriate for children while incorporating subliminal elements that gradually modified behavior and emotional responses over extended periods of exposure. Thomas's attempts to trace the source of these musical techniques had led him through networks of musicians, music teachers, and educational specialists who possessed varying degrees of knowledge about the darker applications of their. Most were unaware that their expertise could be employed for criminal purposes, though a few had admitted to experimental work with techniques that bordered on psychological manipulation. The identification of Cordelia as the likely perpetrator had required careful correlation of testimony from multiple sources, combined with technical analysis that revealed her musical methods were consistent across different cases, despite variations in implementation that reflected individual circumstances. Thomas had been able to establish patterns in her technique that were as distinctive as fingerprints, providing evidence that the same individual was responsible for all the disappearances he had investigated. The challenge of confronting someone who possessed the ability to control behavior through musical manipulation had required Thomas to develop protective measures that would prevent him from falling victim to the same techniques that had proven so effective against children. His understanding of the acoustic principles underlying hypnotic induction had enabled him to create countermeasures that would maintain his psychological independence during any encounter with Cordelia. The protective devices that Thomas had developed included specially tuned instruments that could produce frequencies designed to disrupt hypnotic induction, along with techniques for maintaining mental focus that would resist the influence of compelling melodies. His preparation had drawn upon both scientific understanding of sound psychology and traditional methods for protecting consciousness against external manipulation. The confrontation between Thomas and Cordelia had taken place at a country estate where she had been employed under yet another false identity, caring for children whose parents had begun expressing concerns about changes in their behavior. Thomas had gained access to the household by presenting himself as a music researcher studying regional variations in traditional lullabies, a cover story that provided legitimate reasons for recording and analyzing Cordelia's vocal techniques. The initial meeting between them had appeared to be a pleasant encounter between professional musicians, with Cordelia demonstrating her exceptional vocal abilities while Thomas recorded her performance, using equipment that he claimed was necessary for academic documentation. Neither revealed their true understanding of the significance of what was transpiring, though both recognized that they were engaged in a contest that would determine whether her criminal enterprise would continue or be exposed. Cordelia's attempt to influence Thomas through her musical abilities had been subtle but systematic, incorporating hypnotic elements into their conversation and demonstration that would normally have been sufficient to establish the psychological control she needed to manage potential threats. Her confidence in these techniques had been based on years of successful application against subjects who possessed no defense against her influence. But Thomas's protective measures had proven effective against Cordelia's manipulation, allowing him to maintain awareness of her techniques while appearing to succumb to their influence. His performance of psychological compliance had been convincing enough to avoid arousing her suspicion while providing him with opportunities to gather evidence about her methods and operational procedures. The evidence that Thomas had collected during his encounter with Cordelia had included detailed recordings of her hypnotic lullabies, documentation of her techniques for behavioral modification, and information about the network of contacts that supported her criminal activities. This material would have been sufficient to expose her operations and rescue her victims, had Thomas been able to maintain his freedom long enough to deliver it to appropriate authorities. However, Cordelia's experience with potential threats had prepared her to recognize signs of resistance to her influence, even when such resistance was carefully concealed. Thomas's apparent compliance had not been as convincing as he had hoped, while his technical equipment had aroused suspicions that led to closer examination of his true purposes and capabilities. The revelation of Thomas's investigative activities had prompted Cordelia to modify her approach from subtle influence to direct action that would eliminate the threat he represented while providing her with additional assets for her ongoing operations. Thomas's musical abilities and knowledge of her techniques made him potentially valuable as either an unwilling accomplice or a demonstration of her power over those who might consider opposing her. The transformation that Cordelia had planned for Thomas would serve multiple purposes, neutralizing his threat, while adding his expertise to her criminal enterprise, demonstrating her ability to corrupt even those who understood her methods, and providing her with a male accomplice whose different vocal range would expand the possibilities for her musical manipulations. The process of converting Thomas from investigator to accomplice had required applications of her hypnotic techniques that were more intensive and sophisticated than anything she had previously attempted. His understanding of her methods made him resistant to conventional approaches, while his protective measures had been designed specifically to counter the techniques she normally employed. But Cordelia's mastery of musical psychology had enabled her to develop new approaches that circumvented Thomas's defenses while exploiting vulnerabilities that his protective measures had not anticipated. The extended exposure to carefully crafted musical influences had gradually undermined his resistance while creating new psychological bonds that redirected his loyalty towards serving her interests. The successful conversion of Thomas had marked Cordelia's greatest triumph yet, proving that even informed opposition could be overcome through sufficient application of her unique abilities. His transformation from threat to asset had strengthened her operations while eliminating the most dangerous investigation that her criminal enterprise had ever faced. Thomas's new role within Cordelia's organization had involved using his musical expertise to enhance her techniques while providing male vocal accompaniment that expanded the range of hypnotic effects she could achieve. His knowledge of acoustic principles had enabled improvements to her methods that made them even more effective against potential victims while reducing the risk of detection by other investigators. The integration of Thomas into her criminal network had been seamless, with his genuine musical talents providing perfect cover for activities that would have attracted suspicion if conducted by someone without legitimate artistic credentials. His transformation from investigator to accomplice had been so complete that he genuinely believed his new role represented an improvement over his previous circumstances. As Cordelia's operations continued to expand with Thomas's assistance, her confidence in her methods had reached new heights. She had proven that her techniques could overcome even the most sophisticated opposition, while converting enemies into loyal servants. The silent orchestra of kidnapped children and converted accomplices that surrounded her had become a testament to the irresistible power of music when wielded by someone who understood its darkest applications. The criminal enterprise that had begun with a single stolen child had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a form of organized crime that operated through the systematic application of psychological manipulation disguised as artistic performance. Cordelia had achieved perfect crime that generated renewable income while converting its victims into willing participants who defended their captor against any attempt at rescue or investigation. Her success had demonstrated that conventional understanding of criminal behavior and law enforcement was inadequate to address threats that combined genuine artistic ability with systematic exploitation of human psychological vulnerabilities. The Lullaby kidnapper had created more than a criminal organization. She had established a new form of human relationship that transcended traditional concepts of victim and perpetrator, creating bonds that served her interests while providing genuine benefits to those she controlled. The silent orchestra would continue playing indefinitely, each voice adding to the harmony of perfect crime that had redefined the possibilities for human exploitation while maintaining the appearance of care, education, and artistic enrichment. Cordelia's triumph was complete, her methods undetectable, and her future secure in the knowledge that the most beautiful music was often the most dangerous.